I heard this quote the other day, and I didn't catch the source. But they said, the mind is dyed with the color of our thoughts. So what are you thinking about? Hey, welcome to the Retirement Answer Man Show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host. I'm excited you're here with me today. This is the show dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement, but to have the confidence to rock retirement. Having the confidence to rock retirement, well, a good part of it comes from what you think about. What is it you're focusing your attention on? Obviously in life in general, but from a retirement planning perspective, where are you spending your time thinking when it comes to retirement planning? I like that. The mind is dyed the color of our thoughts. So we got to be careful about what we think about, right? We got to be careful about the inputs that we have when we're thinking about retirement planning, and probably wise to spend most of our time thinking on two things. One is the things that we can actually control in our lives, and two, the things that can have the biggest impact in our lives. So even if we can control it, there are so many things that we can control that really are pretty inconsequential to the trajectory of our retirement. And we don't want to waste time thinking on these little tiny levers when there are big fundamental levers that we can pull that will have a huge impact on our confidence level, on the trajectory of our retirement. And that is what we're trying to discuss this entire month on the show. What are the fundamentals? Now, last week, we talked about casting your vision from the qualitative side and then moving it to the quantitative side. This week, we're going to explore how to get to stage 2 of our project, which is having a plan that is actually feasible. So why don't we go do that? So if you've completed stage 1, you should have a vision for who you are, what's important to you, and then how that is expressed through spending choices based on our needs, our wants, and our wishes, our non-discretionary things and our discretionary items. And the way you would put numbers to those are by when they start and when they stop, how much money, and the frequency of that particular expense. And those spending choices should come from our values and the kind of life we want to live that represents our values. So we always start from the beginning. So you should have had that done by now. Our values expressed through our spending choices. One note here, if you look at a lot of psychology and the research on goal setting, just simply casting this fantastical vision of a future for ourselves has been shown to not that empowering. In fact, simply casting the vision and thinking about success for ourselves in the future and whatever that means by itself actually gives us some of that feel-good emotion that we've done it. And so it ends up not being that motivating from a goal standpoint. And I thought that was very interesting when I was reading this. And what was suggested is you definitely want to do this casting a vision of how you're going to live and the things that you're going to do, but you also need to contrast that with your current state. You need to have that perspective of this is where I'm at. I'm working 60 hours a week. I'm traveling too much. I can't fit in time for myself. I've casted this vision of where I want to go, but you got to remind yourself of this is where I'm at. That's where I want to go. So you can see the gap between what your masterpiece day or masterpiece looks like and what your current life looks like. And there always is going to be a gap there, but just simply dreaming of the future has been shown that it's not enough. You need to contrast it and have that, well, essentially acknowledge that incongruence, which is going to make you potentially feel uncomfortable. And that's okay. That's the point. Because it's that stress of being uncomfortable and seeing the gap of who you could be and who you are that is going to be the motivator to help you start working towards it. And this is why when we bring Agile and being very incremental and trying to collect a lot of really small wins by taking little baby steps, it makes it less intimidating. Because if you just look at the gap, it may be, I have no clue how I get from here to there. But if you can focus on just little baby steps, then you can break it down so it's actionable. So that's why how you do it is so important, because otherwise you could just simply get overwhelmed because you think the gap is too big. So I just wanted to make note of that. We want to think about our ideal retirement, but we also want to contrast it with our current state, because that's going to be stressful in a healthy way to motivate us to start collecting those little wins. Does that make sense? Okay. So now we have an understanding in your fundamentals of this is what my non-discretionary spending looks like. This is what my wants, my discretionary spending looks like, and these are my wishes. And you'll constantly work on refining those numbers. And so if you think of this framework of hope, where we need to have an inspiring goal, agency, and pathways, well, last week was about creating that inspiring goal. So we have that. Agency is the power to act, and we have that through using an agile approach to take little baby steps so we can collect wins and gain momentum. Now we need to see a pathway that will help us bridge the gap and get there, right? But an agency without a pathway is frantic energy, not knowing how to get there. I see where I want to go, but I don't know how to get there. So we need to start creating pathways. And that's what we're going to talk about today in this stage 2 of creating a feasible plan of record. Okay? Here we go. So to get to a feasible plan of record, now we need to turn our attention to what resources do you have to use to fund the spending that you've dreamt up. What resources are you going to be able to use for this? This is the time of life. This is what you've worked for, right? You've deferred so much income in savings and investment and all the things that you do, investing into your pension, etc. This is the time where you're supposed to be harvesting it. So we need to gather what resources you have to fund this, because a dream without resources is just a dream, right? So we need this pathway. So we're going to go through the sources that you're going to use to fund this retirement dream and do some definitions along the way so we can all be on the same page. Again, we're building the fundamentals from the beginning of the yellow brick road. Okay. First resource that you have to pay for life is going to be something that we in the financial world call social capital. We borrowed that from sociology. And social capital, what is that? Those are payments that you receive that come from some collective program, hence the social part of it. So think of Social Security would be a great example of what social capital is. You have guaranteed payments for the rest of your life from the U.S. government or from the Social Security program that are adjusted for inflation. So you're going to want to have a good estimate for what those payments are, when they're going to start, because that's going to help fund all of these dreams. Another example of social capital would be a pension, right? It's a collective program that you've worked and earned, and at a certain date, that payment from the pension plan is going to turn on. Typically, it will last for the rest of your life or joint life or all the other options. Typically, it's not inflation adjusted, so you'll want to know that. But you'll want to know when these payments start, what those payments will be, and whether or not they are adjusted for inflation. So those are what social capital are in financial terms. And so the output is, if you can think yourself building a spreadsheet or putting this into the financial planning software, is the sequence of those income flows that you're going to be receiving between now and when you pass away, because that's going to help fund your life. So that's the first source of capital that we want to have organized. The second source of capital is what we call human capital. This has been your major asset, whether you realize it or not, for the majority of your adult life. Human capital is your ability to earn income. So work, you using work to create income, is using your career capital to generate a salary to fund your life, which is what you've done. Well, in retirement, yes, traditionally that goes away. But more and more we have seen that there are sources of human capital. There is part-time work. There is consulting work that will happen over a period of time. There is incremental work where you do a project or you get bored for a year, so you work at Starbucks or Trader Joe's, and then it goes away. Even those small sums are important to count because they will help fund the spending that you defined in your vision. And we know what the spending is, and we've created that timeline. Now we're creating the timeline of income sources from other things. So for human capital, all these different types of examples I'm talking about, we'll want to define them. When I quote unquote retire, you'll ask yourself, what will I earn? When will that start? And when will that end? Because we'll want to put this into whether it's the financial planning software or a spreadsheet, because this is going to help pay for the spending after full-time work is gone. Personally, I've seen examples of someone who every other year does a consulting project and earns, say $100,000. But then they don't accept one for a year or so, and then they get a little bit bored. Like, okay, I'm willing to do that. And then they go back and do it. So you'll want to just make an initial determination of what, if any, human capital you're going to have. I've seen others where it's, I work at Trader Joe's and I'm going to make 10 grand a year, and it's going to give me some socialization, keep me on my feet, keep me active. And then a year or so in, and I assume I'm going to do that for 5 years, and then maybe that switches. Maybe it's 2 years. The key is you want to make some determination of what, if any, you are projecting, knowing that this is going to change, and that's okay. So that's human capital. So if you think of all of the spending, your needs, wants, and wishes year by year, that's a big outflow of money. Now, social capital is going to help pay for some of that. Human capital, if you have it, may help pay for some of that. Whatever human capital and social capital don't pay for has to come from what we call financial capital, your money. That is the gap of what isn't covered by all these different income sources. So financial capital is typically captured in a statement called the net worth statement. And all a net worth statement is, I know people that have kept this monthly for years. So refresher for you, but there are a lot of people that don't organize things in this way. So what a net worth statement is, and it's a very important statement. I would suggest you have one if you don't. And note to Nicole, who I know listens to this, and here's when I say we're going to do something, and that is we'll share a net worth statement template in 6 Shot Saturday, which is our weekly summary email. And if you're not signed up for our 6 Shot Saturday, you can go sign up at rogerwhitney.com. There's a place to enter your name and email, get that weekly summary where we share links. What a net worth statement is on the left side, you list out all of the assets that you have. So your bank accounts, your savings accounts, your checking accounts, your after-tax brokerage accounts. You list the name of the account. Here's Roger and Shauna's savings account, and the value of the account on a certain date. Let's say the end of February. And so you list those account by account, and you'll have your after-tax accounts, which are the normal accounts I mentioned. And then you're going to have your tax-deferred accounts or your retirement accounts, your 401k, your wife's 401k, your IRA, your husband's IRA, all the accounts that you've built up over time where you contributed to that you haven't paid taxes on yet. And then below that, you're going to have your tax-free assets. These are accounts where there's not going to be a tax when the money comes out. So that's going to be your Roth IRA and 401ks, your health savings account. So you'll have those 3 categories, and you'll just list account by account, the name of the account, who owns it, and the value of the account on a certain date. And below that, you'll have properties. You'll have here, this is my house, and this is the estimated value. This is my rental property. Here's the estimated value. And you'll sum all that up at the bottom, and you'll have a total of the value of all of your assets. And then on the right hand of the column, you'll do the same, but for your debts. So your mortgage, the balance of your mortgage, what you owe on your mortgage, the balance of what you owe on a car, etc. And then at the bottom of the page, you'll summarize the value of all of the money that you owe to other people. And then you'll subtract that from all of your assets. And then you have what's called your net worth statement. It's a wonderful document. We've done whole shows on the net worth over the last 8 years. And this is something that you want to have organized as you're putting together your plan. Now, a note about this, in your plan, when you're figuring out what financial capital you're going to use to pay for your life, you're going to exclude things like your house, because your house is what I would call a use asset. And what I mean by that is this is an asset that you gain. It's not going to produce dividends for you or income for you. It's just something you use to have a roof over your head. A car would be a use asset. Unless you're going to sell the asset and realize the money, it's really just a use asset. So we don't want to use those when we're calculating whether our plan is feasible or not. So once we have this organized, and this will be in the software that you're using or spreadsheet form, one thing that we're going to need in order to project whether your dream is feasible is we're going to need to have some basic assumptions, right? So we're going to have assumptions on inflation, because the money that you need to spend in 10 years, let's say you need to spend $100,000 in 10 years. Well, inflation is going to eat away at that purchasing power. So we want to make sure there's some adjustment for that so we can maintain our lifestyle. So we're going to have an inflation assumption. And if you're investing assets, we're going to have a return assumption. What return will I receive on my portfolio over time? And then we're going to have assumptions about taxes. And a lot of software is already going to do some of these things for you. The big thing on assumptions, and I think we had a question last week about how critical assumptions are. The big thing about assumptions are that they're assumptions. You're not going to get them right. The key is to at least have some framework for how you make them that is reasonable. So as an example, the two primary ways that people make assumptions on inflation and market returns, etc., is they just look at history. They use historical returns of inflation over the last 20, 30, 40 years. We did a lot of that last month when we focused on inflation. We look at the historical returns on stocks or bonds or the combinations of those things. And we just use what that average return is. That's using a historical record. Another way of doing assumptions is doing a forecasted return assumption. Generally, the way that works is we take the historical record and based on some methodology, interest rates, business cycle, inflation, growth expectations for the economy, etc., we adjust the historical assumption to what we predict will happen in the future based on the data on the ground. Which one is right? Neither of them. They're all going to be wrong. The key is to have some consistent assumptions. As long as you have some reasonable assumptions, don't spend too much time here, because if you're using an agile approach, you'll be making assessments and readjustments along the way as reality unfolds. The process or the practice of planning is going to be much more important than the accuracy of your assumption, because you can't get accurate because we don't know the future. So now that we have that, how do we assess? Now that we know what our spending is going to be, needs, wants, and wishes, now we know what our income sources are going to be, social capital, human capital, and we have our financial capital, and we've identified we're going to need X amount from our financial capital because it's not covered by these other sources. Then the question is, how do we determine whether this is even feasible? Because if I live to 100, I don't want to die broke. How do we know whether this is feasible or not? So the way you determine whether it's feasible is to use a scale, right? If you think of a scale and you put on one side of the scale all of the resources you have, all of these cash flows from Social Security and maybe a pension, all of the assets that you have. And then on the other side of the scale, you want to put all the liabilities you have. So even if you don't have any debt on your net worth statement, you still have liabilities, right? Because the money that you owe yourself in 10 years to pay for your life, well, that's money that has to be there. You owe that money, you just owe it to yourself. So you want to think of your consumption, the money you need to spend the life of you, as a debt you owe yourself, as a future payment to someone. That someone just happens to be you. So we want to have a scale where we have all the resources we have. And on the other end, we want to have all the liabilities that we're going to incur during retirement, that paying for ourselves, and to see how they match up. Do we have enough resources to cover the liabilities? Do they equal out? Do we have a lot more spending liabilities than we have assets? Do we have a lot more assets relative to the spending liability we have? This will get us to the initial assessment of what we call fundedness. How funded are we for all these spending liabilities that we have? And the way we frame fundedness is you're either underfunded, meaning that your liabilities, all the spending that you want to do, isn't supported by the assets. The scales tip too far in terms of liabilities versus spending. That's underfunded. That means it's not feasible without some adjustments. Constrained means that, it's one of those scales where they're sort of equal, but it sort of tilts to one side or the other, and it bounces back and forth. And that's where most people are going to be. And then overfunded means you have a lot more resources between social capital, human capital, and financial capital than you have in spending. So another way of saying that is you've saved too much. You've done too well relative to your spending. That's a very nice place to be, but it also creates risks and opportunities. So essentially, you want to put these resources on a scale to see where you're at from a fundedness standpoint. And there's two ways of doing this. Which way is better, by the way? We'll just go there. I use both. Not all the time, but I use both and run them concurrently in a lot of cases. So the first way is probably the one you're most familiar with. And this is traditional financial planning software. When you're entering your spending, your assets, your Social Security, you may have done this online. In the Rock Retirement Club, we use New Retirement Plus Calculator, which is an example of one of these types of software. And the way that traditional software determines where you're at relative to your liabilities is it takes your assets and it forecasts forward into the future. So it's making assumptions on the returns that you're going to get into the future and the cash flows that you're going to get into the future. And then it figures out whether you have enough assets considering the growth rate on your portfolio to fund your future liabilities. So this is forecasting outward. So if you think of like a cone, the small part of the cone is today, and then it's going to forecast into the future possible outcomes. So there could be a wide dispersion at the other end. And when you use software like this, I don't want to get too geeky here. There's two main ways that software does this forecasting forward. And this goes to some of the point of the question on investment returns last week. One way is what's called a linear return. So let's assume you make a return assumption of 7.5% for your portfolio. So it's going to take your $1 million and it's going to assume that you earn 7.5% every single year for the rest of your life. And then it'll put in the spending cash flows and so forth on top of that overlay. So that's called a linear return. So it takes the average and just assumes you get the average every single year. And that is what you would essentially do if you created a spreadsheet. And there's a lot of the base new retirement planning tool uses this linear form. That's okay for directional, but we want to be careful with a linear return because it likely will overestimate the feasibility of the plan, because having a consistent return every single year is nirvana, because we don't get that. I don't have the chart in front of me, but if we just look at the stock market, the S&P 500, and we look at what the average return has been over the last, say, 80 years, and I'm not going to get these numbers right, but you'll get the point. A very, very small percentage of the time was the actual 1-year return within 1 percentage point of the average. Because in the real world, we have, last year where we're up, whatever the percentage was. This year so far, we're down. Other years we're flat. We have sequences of return and they go in streaks typically. And that is a big influence on your retirement plan because you're taking money out. So we got to be careful about linear returns, or at least understand their limitations. Another way that traditional financial planning software looks at it is something called Monte Carlo scenarios. And so what a Monte Carlo scenario does is it doesn't use a linear return, but it actually overlays the variability of returns based on the portfolio using a statistic called standard deviation. So in a Monte Carlo scenario, like a linear scenario, it will forecast forward, but rather than just do one sequence of returns in a linear fashion, it'll say, no, we're going to run 1,000 versions of our spending life. And the only difference between one version and the next is what kind of return sequence we get. So one sequence will be bear market, bad, 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 and then normal and good, and everything in between. And then at the end of all those iterations, what we'll get is what percentage of those return versions or iterations were we successful in the spending? So it gives us a little bit more color as to whether this plan is feasible using long-term projections and factor in the fact that, hey, markets go up and down and we can't predict that. They're a lot more better. Is that a phrase? They're better than linear returns, but they're more complicated. There's nothing wrong with doing a linear return, but I just want to outline those distinctions. So that's traditional planning software. So this is one of these two methods is likely the software that you use, whether it's through Fidelity or through New Retirement or on an online calculator or a spreadsheet you created yourself. And that is very helpful in determining feasibility. Now, the second approach, which is not as traditional, is rather than forecasting forward into the future and making return assumptions, another approach is something called using a household balance sheet. And the way that this differs from, say, your net worth statement is that rather than forecast forward, it brings everything back to today's value. So it takes your financial capital, your assets, and it says, if they're worth $1 million, they're worth $1 million. I'm not going to make any estimation on what they could grow because I just don't know. But when I look at my Social Security, I know what those flows of payments are. And so I'm going to use just a net present value based on the inflation-adjusted cash flows to bring them back to one value that I can put on a balance sheet. So rather than look at your Social Security as these payments you receive year by year, what a household balance sheet would do is calculate the value of those payments today. Let's say it's $2 million for the couple, and it'll put a present value of social capital as $2 million on your balance sheet today. And then it will do the same thing with your spending. If you're going to spend $100,000 a year, inflation adjusted for 30 years, rather than forecast those payments forward, it will do a net present value and say, hey, this spending has a value today of X, and we'll put that as a liability on our balance sheet so we can compare apples to apples. So rather than forecasting forward, it's bringing everything back to today. And I would think of these things, whether it's traditional software or the household balance sheet, as a scale. It does not say that you're going to be okay. It is not deterministic. It is simply a measure of, at this point in time, will it work? Or is it feasible? Life changes tomorrow because you change your spending, or the markets change, or inflation changes, or whatever. You'll have to remeasure, put everything else back on the scale. And that's one reason why you need to be agile. So these are not deterministic. So when you see a awesome success ratio in whatever form you use, understand it's just a measure of the weights in one period of time. And just like measuring yourself on a scale, you got to do it in a systematic way so you can see when it's starting to vary and figure out what adjustments, if any, you need to make. So this would be the approach to use to find out if your plan is feasible. Now, feasible, what does feasible mean? Well, feasible means that at this point in time, it looks like I have enough resources on one side of the scale to pay for all these liabilities, my spending on the other side. That doesn't mean that you can't get knocked off course easily, right? With Social Security goes away, markets go down by 20%, a big life event, expense happens. Those things could knock you off course really quickly or sink you. So it's not enough to have a feasible plan in the next stage, which is next week. Now, if we have a feasible plan of record, we have to work on how do we make it resilient? Then that will help give you a stable heading and help you have more confidence that you can do the things that you want to do in order to close that gap between today and what you want out of life. And so we're going to do that next week. But for now, let's move on to some listener questions. This show is sponsored by LTCI Partners. They are an independent brokerage firm focusing on long-term care solutions. Now, when we're talking about making a plan resilient, and we'll talk about this next week, one of the things you want to stress test is what happens if I have a long-term care event? What does that do to my plan? Well, LTCI Partners has access to many different types of insurance policies where you can help mitigate that risk. So if you're interested in taking a look at how do I mitigate or manage the long-term care risk, you can go to ltcipartners.com rogerwhitney.com/RAM. So now let's get to some of your listener questions. If you have a question for the show, you can go to rogerwhitney.com/Ask Roger. And our first question comes from Jim regarding Social Security. And it's an audio question, one of my favorites. So let's hear what Jim has to say.
Hi, Roger. This is Jim from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm 53 and actually turning in my resignation to do my pre-retirement or first retirement from my corporate career next week. After that, who knows? I'm kind of interested in some of the topics that have been going on the podcast lately about what are people doing next. I'm probably do something to keep busy, have fun, but something totally different than the field I've been in for the past 30 some years. My question's around Social Security planning. I use the government Social Security website, log in, has all my records, do the estimates to figure out what amounts I'll get at the different retirement ages. The question is, those amounts, are they in today's dollars or the dollars in the year that it's projecting that I would be getting that? So in other words, if I am looking at what the amount is when I'm 70, is that in today's dollars or is that the actual amount that I'll get in that year, which is 17 years away from now? I've scoured the Social Security site, can't find any answers. I've went all through Google looking for different answers, can't find anything. So I didn't know if you had any insight on that and any advice on that. So appreciate it. Keep up the good work. Thanks.
Hey, Jim. Well, congratulations on your retirement, your pre-retirement. That's exciting. That's an exciting time of life. You get the best of both worlds. So I'm excited for this journey. Now, on your question on the Social Security estimates, if you look on your paper statement, that's going to be in today's dollars. And unless you have an option, because there are a couple calculators on the Social Security site that allow you to toggle between today and future dollars. So you can look for those. So they will be adjusted roughly for actual inflation. So they should be in the ballpark, but it's not going to be an exact match. Now, take a look at the online benefits calculator at SSA.gov or the quick calculator. And I think one of those, I can't recall which one, allows you to toggle between today and future dollars. Now, another thing that you might want to do, because you're leaving full-time employment so early, 53, dude, that's awesome. I would use their detailed calculator. And in the detailed calculator, you can enter every single year of earnings that you have. And the reason you might want to do this is because when you look at your Social Security statement and it tells you what your benefit will be at full retirement age, it is assuming that you're going to have that kind of work record between now and full retirement age. And for you, Jim, you're likely not going to, right? You potentially were a high earner for a number of years, and now maybe you're going to work making much more modest sums. So if you use the detailed calculator, because you're so young, like you said, you're 17, 18 years away, you can input your estimated earnings from 53 until full retirement age, and maybe those are zeros, maybe they're 20 grand a year, and it will give you a more nuanced estimate of what your actual benefit might be, given the fact that you're not going to continue the kind of earnings record that you've had up till now. So hopefully that helps you on your way, and I'm glad you're enjoying the show. So our next question comes from Michael on what to do with his cash-like portion of his quote-unquote pie cake. If you're not familiar with pie cakes, they're very delicious, and we're going to talk about them next week. And we pared your question down a little bit, Michael, because you gave a lot of detail. Michael says, I love the show. It's been very informative. That's awesome. I just turned 63, still working, and plan to retire in the middle of next year when my wife turns 62. I'm not going to work much longer, and I have stage 4 prostate cancer. Although I plan to be around for another 10 plus years, there is no guarantee, so I want to have some time in retirement. Well, bless you, Michael, and I wish you all the best. Yeah, I wish you all the best, and I'll pray for you. And I think you're smart. And unfortunately, sometimes those events are the things that say, hey, I got to make hay while the sun's shining. So I'm glad that you're doing that. For the past few years, Michael says, I've had my money in a balanced fund that appears to be about a 60-40 stock to bond mix. Starting in 2021, I started moving a small portion out of the balanced fund and into a stable value fund for the bond side of the allocation and the S&P 500 for the equity side of the allocation. The stable value is only getting about 1.2%. So after fees, I'm netting about 1%. But bond funds seem to be doing negative returns this year, and short-term bond funds aren't doing any better than the stable value fund. I'm kind of making a layer cake plan for my retirement and have the idea of keeping 4 to 5 years of anticipated drawdown as dry powder that will be fully available regardless of the market loss. So I'm thinking for now, Michael says, at least of not putting any of that dry powder in bond funds since interest rates are probably going to go up and that would make my bond funds go down. What are your thoughts on keeping this much money in almost like cash investments that are getting tiny returns and actually losing value due to inflation? Would I do better in bond funds? So that's a great question, Michael, and we're going to get into some of this next week. So that will help give more color to this. But I think when you're building an asset allocation, and you'll understand this, everybody, when we're talking about what a pie cake is, an asset allocation is like a pie chart. If it's 60% stocks and 40% bonds, it has two flavors to that pie, right? It has stocks and it has bonds. And that kind of asset allocation comes from long-term investing, the modern portfolio theory, where you embrace risk and you just accept what the returns are because you have such a long term. Well, in retirement, Michael, and I think you've gotten this fact, is that, hey, I'm going to need money to spend these liabilities. I owe myself, say, $100,000 a year or two from now. I got to have the money for that. I don't want it at risk, whether it's in bonds or in stocks. And so I would say, actually build the pie cake. So, and again, we'll get into this next week, but I think it's totally fine to have cash-like investments that are getting tiny returns if it's money that you know you're going to need to fund your life, say, within the next 5 years. And yes, inflation is going to eat away at it. And you can try to mitigate that erosion from inflation by using a stable value fund or using inflation-adjusted bonds and so forth. We'll talk a little bit about that in the last week of the show, or this month. But yes, so inflation is going to erode it, but it's in the short near term, so it's not going to be that significant. Inflation is definitely annoying and painful on the short term, but it's a big risk on the long term. And conversely, losing money, whether it's because bond funds are going down or stocks are going down, is a big risk on the short term and not as much of a risk on the long term because you have time on your side. So I think it's perfectly fine to have a lot of liquidity to pay for life in the early years and realize that your return on the capital is much of a concern as the return of your capital in order to fund your spending. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. I'm a big fan of using a stable value fund. And for those of you that don't know, a stable value fund is a quirky thing that is offered in 401k plans. Not all of them, that typically have better yields than, say, a normal money market or online savings account. So, Michael, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Let's get one more question in here from Mark about bond ladders and I-bonds.
Good afternoon, Roger. My name is Mark, and I have been a faithful listener to you and want to appreciate your words of wisdom and guidance. Had a question for you about bonds and bond ladders. I was looking at different municipal and corporate bonds, and a friend told me about I-bonds. There's a minimum of 5 years without any penalty, and less than that, you forfeit 3 months interest. The interest is exempt from state and local tax. It's inflation adjusted, which is really attractive, and at least it seemed like it to me. And I was looking in May through October, the rate was 5.3%. And for November through April of 2022, it's a 7%. Anyways, want to get your thoughts and inputs about bond ladders and I-bonds in particular. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Well, good question, Mark. Now, I-bonds, I know we've covered a number of times, and I think they're very attractive because they have a stable value and they have this inflation adjustment on an ongoing basis. And you outlined some of the specifics of how long you have to hold them. I'm a big fan of them. I buy them myself, and we like the idea of building contingency funds and having a safety net within I-bonds. The big difficulty is you can only buy $10,000 a year, and that makes it difficult to allocate a lot of resources to it. That said, I have situations where we've systematically done that over a number of years, and I'm really glad that we did. So I like I-bonds. The second question was about bond ladders. So what is a bond ladder? So if you can picture a ladder in your head of it stair steps one by one. And the concept of a bond ladder is let's say you buy a 5-year bond ladder. So what you would do is if you had $500,000, you would buy a bond that matured in a year, and then you would buy a bond that matured in 2 years, and then in 3 years, and then in 4 years, and then in 5 years. So every year you have money coming due that you have to reinvest. So in a rising interest rate environment, as a bond becomes new or matures, then you could build it out and buy another bond 5 years out again. So you'd be able to take advantage of the higher interest rates because you have this short-term bond coming due. Conversely, if interest rates are going down, you have a longer-term bond that will be stable, and then you keep building the ladder out. So over time, and there's been a lot of studies on this, it can work out very well if you stay true to the bond ladder. And that way, you always have money coming due that you're reinvesting at the high end of the ladder, and you average everything out. Not a bad strategy. Implementation is another question. To go back to this question and sort of wrap it into the last question, let's assume you need to spend $100,000 a year. And so you have $500,000 that you have to spend. That's a liability you owe yourself over 5 years. You could do, and I have done, a bond ladder where I have money coming due roughly around the time when I know I'm going to spend it. And rather than build the ladder out, I actually spend the money. That's another way to make sure that you have the assets to cover the liability of spending. So good question. So next week, we're going to get into how to make this feasible plan resilient from a fundamental standpoint. But for now, let's go set a SMART sprint.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to take a little baby step you can take in the next 7 days to not just rock retirement, but rock life. All right. This is week 3 of building the fundamentals. Are you overwhelmed? It's like, wow, this is a lot to do. It's not really. If you break everything down in its individual parts, it's very manageable. The key is, and this is why I like an agile approach, is it is intimidating when you look at the whole thing. And in life, it's natural to be, when you look at the whole thing, to not get started. It's like trying to clean a closet. You look at it and like, oh, no, or the garage. I can't go in there. Yeah, I know I have to do it. I can't go in there and do that. So you close the door. It's so intimidating when you look at the whole thing. The key is to create little micro wins and just do a little bit at a time. So as you think of these foundational things, don't look at the whole thing. Just do a little baby step. And when you do that baby step, say, awesome. And then do another little baby step, like a garage. Go take one thing out and put it in the garbage and then walk away. Come back the next day. Do another little thing and throw it away. That's what you want to do. And you want to celebrate every little baby step that you do. That's the key to doing this. And that's why I think we need an agile approach, because it is intimidating. And secondly, that's why we need to make sure we focus on the right things. Because if we throw unimportant things, unfoundational things to think about, it makes it even more intimidating. So keep it simple, focus on the fundamentals, and take little baby steps. See what you can do over the next 7 days. I get to go to San Francisco this weekend. Actually, by the time you hear this, I'm already back. Excited to go to San Francisco. And then I'm going to San Diego to give a speech on why the future of retirement is agile. We'll see how that's received. That'll be fun. I hope you have a wonderful week, and we'll talk again next Wednesday. Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize this is helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.